Welcome, everyone, to History Gone Wilder, part of Have History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time, Johnston became disillusioned with the Army. Now we move with him to the war with Mexico, and the build-up to the American Civil War. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, or purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. During the 1830s, Abingdon, Virginia felt much less like home to Johnston. His father passed away in 1831. His brother Charles and his wife drowned in the Potomac River traveling from Alexandria to Washington, D.C., and his oldest brother John passed away. What was left of the family in Abingdon now moved away, most of them to South Carolina. Even the family slaves were sold off to pay debts. So, when Johnston went home after 1838, it was usually to Columbia, South Carolina. As part of the Corps of Topographical Engineers, Johnston would be dispatched all over the country, with a surveying excursion in 1838 to New York, then back to South Florida for the winter. In 1839, the Army sent him to the newly admitted state of Michigan to survey the border between the United States and Canada. He made it to Detroit in July. He was to survey the country between Lake Huron and Lake Superior, north of the Straits of Mackinac, and choose locations for fortifications. Johnston and the other surveyors spent the summer surveying, then went back to Washington to draw the corresponding maps. One of the men on this journey was 2nd Lieutenant Robert McLean. The two grew close on their expedition, even though they were opposite in characteristics, Johnston being more reserved than the outgoing McLean. Over Christmas, McLean, whose family home lay not far from the capital on the Chesapeake in Maryland, invited Johnston to spend the holidays there. Johnston gladly came to the 2-story brick mansion called Bohemia, where he was introduced to McLean's family, including his 18-year-old sister, Lydia, who everyone called Lyd. For all of Johnston's aloofness to love, he confessed to one of his friends that, "You are a bachelor because insensible to such charms as furnish my life with its little share of happiness, while I, on the contrary, am so vastly susceptible as to face the influence of every female fascination between the St. Lawrence and the Gulf of Mexico, the Mississippi, and the Atlantic. So many attractions operating in different directions neutralize each other, of course, and they can't operate together, you know, because polygamy is contrary to the statute." For Johnston, who fell half in love with every pretty woman he met, Lydia became the woman he felt he could fall completely in love with, but he did not act immediately. In the spring of 1842, he went to survey Sackett's Harbor in New York, then back to Washington for the winter. In the winter of 1842, Johnston went back to Florida, all the while communicating with Lydia. It may have been because he didn't feel financially stable enough to start a family, or it may have been the age discrepancy, with Johnston being 15 years older than Lydia. Nevertheless, he continued the romance during his many expeditions. In Florida, Johnston was made the Assistant Adjutant General under General William Worth. Worth decided not to attempt to engage with the Seminoles, but burn their towns and destroy their crops as a way to wage war against the tribe. Johnston would say of Worth, "General Worth is my earliest admiration as a military man, and has always shown the kindest disposition for me, and his family is such a one as nobody else can boast of. These things together make the position of Adjutant General more agreeable in his staff than that of any other general." While in Florida, one of Johnston's nephews, who was attending West Point, wrote to him, accusing his uncle of being a ladies' man while on these expeditions. Johnston wrote back, No, women are pleasant and attractive creatures beyond denial when one has nothing else to think of or to excite him, but those who believe such a story know me little. There are not, never were, women enough in the world to allure me from the chance of one hostile shot." He stayed in Florida only a short time, then headed back to Washington where he could make regular visits to Lydia. After a year, they would become engaged. Lydia was now 23, and Johnston was 38. They married on July 10, 1845, at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Baltimore, Maryland. One of Johnston's biographers wrote, "As distant as he often seemed to others, as formal and precise as he was to strangers, Lydia was the one person with whom he shared all his private hopes and terrors. Theirs was a relationship that grew slowly and ripened fully over many years. Their correspondence brimmed with affection, even passion. The publicly restrained Johnston concluded his letters to his wife with, 'Good night, my love, my life, my soul.' Lydia's sweetness was a perfect counterpoint to her husband's occasional irritability. One contemporary commented that Lydia supplied many of the qualities in which he was so lacking, and that she did more to keep him out of hot water and smooth over the rough places than anybody else in the world. The year after Johnston's marriage to Lydia, the U.S.-Mexico border dispute erupted in a war between the two nations, with the United States mobilizing its small army and recruiting volunteers to bolster the ranks. General Winfield Scott, whom Johnston had served under previously, formed up his staff, which included Johnston and other men who would play significant roles in Johnston's future. The staff included Robert E. Lee, Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard from Louisiana, George McClellan, and George Gordon Meade. Scott would lead an invasion of Mexico starting at Veracruz. Johnston traveled by steamer to New Orleans. The whole time he suffered horribly from seasickness. He shared a cabin with Lee, who was unaffected by the movement of the vessel. From there they traveled to the mouth of the Rio Grande, and by March 5th Johnston arrived off the coast of Veracruz. Soldiers landed on March 9th, and by March 10th, Johnston, Scott, and the rest of the staff made landfall, to the great relief of Johnston, whose seasickness debilitated him while on board the vessel. The Mexican defenders gave up ground easily and quickly, allowing the U.S. troops to establish a beachhead and then cut the city of Veracruz off from the land with the army and from the sea by the navy. Scott sent a letter to the Mexican governor of Veracruz asking for surrender. Johnston carried the letter to Juan Morales at 2 p.m. on March 22nd, bearing a white flag. The governor wrote out a polite but firm response that he couldn't surrender the city, and it was handed to Johnston, who took it back to Scott. Scott's artillery opened on the city on March 24th, and by the next day Morales escaped by boat out of the city. On the 26th, the Mexican people hung a white flag over the walls of the city. Johnston and Lee took part in the surrender ceremony. Scott wasted no time pushing inland to get away from the Mexican coast and the yellow fever that would soon break out. In the van of the army was Brigadier General David E. Twiggs' division, and accompanying the division was Johnston. Scott used his engineers also as scouts because of their superior knowledge of terrain. When Twigg and Johnston got to Cerro Gordo, the location of the Mexican army under Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, Twigg sent Johnston and another officer forward to examine the Mexican position. When the two men got close, the Mexican artillery opened up, and Johnston was hit by a piece of grape shot, severely wounding him. He was brought to the village of Plan del Rio. While in a makeshift hospital, Johnston had to endure the disgusting and inappropriate comments of a volunteer officer. Johnston suffered in silence until the officer told his servant to go steal a baby goat from a herd being shepherded by the hospital. The dignified Johnston finally said something to the coarse man. "If you dare to do that, I'll have you court-martialed and cashiered or shot." Johnston remained at the hospital for 2 weeks before being able to rejoin the army as it marched inland. The wounds weren't life-threatening, and his courage brought him a promotion to brevet lieutenant colonel, bypassing the rank of major. The higher rank meant that he would leave Scott's staff, but he would be a part of one of the regiments recruited in the United States and sent to the front in Mexico. Johnston had to wait for his new command to arrive in August. He would be the lieutenant colonel of a new type of unit composed of riflemen and dubbed light infantry, called voltigeurs. Soon the American army moved out from Puebla. Within the army was Johnston's nephew Preston, recently graduated from West Point. The two became even closer due to their close proximity in the invading army. The American army descended the mountains into the valley containing the Mexican capital, Mexico City. Johnston, in the division commanded by Percifer Smith, was ordered to cross the lava beds on the American right in order to secure the road leading to the capital. The division crossed the hazardous terrain and found they were nearly surrounded by Mexican forces. Smith planned an attack and sent Robert E. Lee through the lava beds to inform Scott of the planned assault and to ask for a simultaneous assault on the American left to fully rout the Mexicans. The 6 a.m. attack worked, and the two wings of the American army crushed the Mexican position. As the two halves of the army met in the Mexican entrenchments, the comrades began to shake each other's hands and congratulate one another on the stunning victory. Johnston spied Lee and went up to shake his hand. Lee's eyes began to well up with tears as he grabbed Johnston's hand and told Johnston that the night before, while manning his cannon, Preston was killed. Days later, Johnston would write, "I have never known the full bitterness of grief. Nobody else could love him as I have done. He was the pride of my heart, and I'll look to him for stay and comfort in declining years. I cannot tell you the bitterness of this event." The army moved on toward the capital. Johnston took part in the Battle of Molino del Rey, guarding the American left flank against Mexican cavalry, and then joining the main assault that saw the Americans fight house to house. Johnston won great praise for his bravery in those attacks. The next obstacle in the way of the Americans was the fortified military academy of Chapultepec. Johnston was to lead the main assault, with 4 companies of the Voltigeurs taking the southern gate and advancing halfway up the hill toward the citadel. Once halfway up, the assault party, armed with ladders, would pass through them and take Chapultepec. Not to miss out on the battle, Pierre-Gustave Toutant Beauregard joined the Voltigeurs in their attack. As the riflemen waited for the men with ladders to pass through them, they were subjected to a horrendous volume of musketry, but it wasn't accurate. Many of the Mexican soldiers, to avoid exposing themselves, just placed their weapons over the walls and fired blindly, but it was enough to pin down the Americans. Beauregard, during this critical point, called out to Johnston, "Colonel, what will you bet on this shot?" Johnston immediately caught the spirit of the question and called back, "Drinks in the city of Mexico." Beauregard thereupon fired, and whether or not his bullet found its mark, he called back to Johnston, "You have lost. You'll have to pay it." When the assault party with ladders made it to Johnston's line, they hesitated. Taking the initiative, Johnston led both his troops and the other soldiers over the walls, capturing the ramparts of Chapultepec and the citadel. For his gallantry during the battle, he was given another promotion. Next, Johnston took another prominent role in the attack on Mexico City, helping to capture the capital and put it under American control. The occupation of the city was fairly dull service. Johnston presided over court-martials and attempted to keep the peace between the American soldiers and the Mexican civilians. The war was essentially over, and the most difficult moment was the loss of his nephew. Preston's parents had drowned in the Potomac River, and he had been orphaned. Family had took him and his sister in, and his Uncle Joe had looked after him from afar and been a constant companion in the young man's life. Decades later, Johnston still grieved over the young man's death. The end of the Mexican War brought with it vast amounts of land now under the control of the United States, and Johnston envisioned a great empire stretching deep into Mexico and controlling most of the coast in the Gulf of Mexico. Being a topographical engineer and a soldier, he salivated at the thought of exploring this territory and putting it on a map. He wrote to a friend, "I can't help building castles in the air." With this new accumulation of land, politicians and businessmen, north and south, wanted to link it together by rail, forming a transcontinental railroad. Some favored a northern route from Chicago to California, others from St. Louis to California, and some a southern route from Vicksburg to California. Johnston's commander, Colonel James Abert, was a strong ally of the southern route through Texas, and when Congress appropriated $50,000 for surveys through various territories and states, including Texas, Abert assigned Johnston the role of surveying a possible route for the railroad from San Antonio to El Paso. With a company of soldiers and 20 civilian laborers, Johnston cut a road from San Antonio to El Paso, arriving there in September. By the time the group made it back to San Antonio, it was November. Johnston got the railroad fever when a group of businessmen from the east wanted to hire him to survey for the San Antonio and Rio Grande Railroad. The deal fell through, only lasting a winter, so Johnston spent most of 1852 in Texas performing his military duties. In the fall of that year, he received a year's extended leave, spending most of that time in Baltimore with Lydia. When his year was over, he was assigned to supervise river improvements on the Arkansas, Mississippi, and Ohio rivers. He became seriously ill in the spring of 1854, sweating out a fever in Little Rock, Arkansas. He used his ill health to get reassigned to Washington. While there, word spread throughout the Army that Secretary of War Jefferson Davis was pushing for more regiments to add to the Army, and this posed a great opportunity for Johnston to rise up in rank, because the topographical engineers had limited possibilities in promotion. In 1855, the new regiments were formed, and the officers were announced. Johnston was disappointed that he wasn't given command of one of the regiments, but he was put in second in command of the 1st United States Cavalry Regiment, with Edwin Sumner being its commander. Albert Sidney Johnston got command of the 2nd U.S. Cavalry, and Robert E. Lee became that regiment's second in command. Again, Johnston and Lee's military careers were paralleling. The regiment would be stationed at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. Johnston didn't care for his superior, thinking that he was too accustomed to the old ways of doing things and not willing to adapt to situations. He wrote about Sumner, "You have yet to learn how ignorant a man can keep himself who relies for knowledge upon experience and yet never observes or remembers." Another time he wrote, "The best opinions an officer of this regiment can cultivate are, that is to say for his own comfort, that he is utterly ignorant professionally, and that his colonel is not. The last most difficult." One of the regiment's first assignments was to put down an uprising of Sioux in the Wyoming Territory. The column rode out for several hard weeks to Fort Laramie, only to find the crisis was over, and they were returned to Fort Leavenworth. Johnston was appalled that the regiment lost 70 horses during the expedition, an occurrence he attributed to Sumner's inability or ignorance in taking care of their mounts. Sumner made Johnston's life miserable in the 1st Cavalry. The only redeeming quality was that Lydia was there to greet him home every evening, and the friendships he had cultivated. A young captain named George B. McClellan was taken under Johnston's wing, and the two became very close. Even Lydia enjoyed McClellan's company. Most of the time, Johnston's letters to McClellan would end with "Mrs. J. sends her love." The two joked with one another all the time. McClellan one time joked that an efficient commander would issue women right along with horses to the soldiers. Johnston responded that another officer is charmed with your notion of assimilating allowances of women and horses, and flatters himself that his chances of applying those principles are pretty fair, as there is a suspicion prevailing that we shall be sent to Utah next summer. When McClellan resigned from the army, Johnston wrote to him, "Nothing since the 14th of August, '47, the day Preston died, has grieved me so much. It has overturned many castles in the air. On the subject of professional daily talks, reading, fencing, marches, and coffee talks, chases of buffalo, wolves, and Indians, there is no one left in the regiment or army to take your place. I wish I was young enough to resign too." The 1st Cavalry was called into action as the violence in Kansas over the issue of slavery became widespread. The pro-slavery governor of the territory was under orders from President Franklin Pierce that the anti-slavery legislature wasn't to meet, and called in the 1st Cavalry to prevent it from taking place. Johnston was part of that group who tried to keep the peace between the civilians, a task he felt beneath the regiment. Edwin Sumner, the regiment's commander, became the scapegoat when political backlash over not letting the anti-slavery legislature meet hit the governor and the president. Sumner was removed from command, even though he was just following orders. Johnston was overjoyed that Sumner was gone, and one of his Mexican War commanders was put in his place, Percifer Smith. Johnston was soon sent eastward to Jefferson Barracks, just outside of St. Louis, but he would be called back to Kansas to survey the southern border of the proposed state. Violence had prevented the survey from taking place any earlier. The survey expedition was a large one, with Johnston commanding 4 cavalry companies and 2 infantry companies under the command of Captain Richard Brooke Garnett. Johnston requested no new recruits were to be on this expedition, but when he got to Fort Leavenworth, the majority of his force were green troops, some of them never been in the saddle. He described the situation to McClellan. Fully 120 boobies who never straddled a horse, starting on an expedition of nearly 2,000 miles with a chance of getting into an occasional skirmish with the best horsemen in the world. The expedition laid the cornerstone for the southeast corner of Kansas and then headed west over 400 miles, crossing the Neosho and Arkansas rivers. At one point they were approached by a band of Osage. The interaction was friendly enough, each side trading goods back and forth, but the Osage became disgruntled when Johnston's men had no tobacco to spare in a trade. The only attack they suffered was by some Kiowa who stole one wagon and killed its wagon master. Pursuit of the culprits yielded no result. After laying the cornerstone for the southwest corner of Kansas, they began their trip back to Fort Leavenworth. Since the end of the Mexican War, politicians and businessmen, particularly Southerners, were land-hungry to expand slavery into the Southwest and build an empire for the United States. Santa Anna had been ousted and 2 governments ruled over Mexico, one in Mexico City and the other in Veracruz, with Benito Juarez as its president. The United States hoped to buy more land from Mexico and sought to entice either of the Mexican governments to relinquish the land if the United States recognized them as the official government of Mexico. Robert McLean, Johnston's brother-in-law, was sent as the minister of Mexico to declare which government to be legitimate. Johnston traveled to Mexico with him. Previous to his journey, Johnston, McClellan, and other Army officers discussed the possibilities of obtaining the northern half of Mexico and what that would mean for them and the country. Johnston was hopeful for expanded business ventures in the newly acquired territory, but when he and Robert arrived at Veracruz, Juarez was less than supportive of handing over land to the United States, even for recognition and money. Johnston's hopes were dashed, and he and Robert returned to Washington. In the spring of 1859, Johnston was made the Inspector General of the New Mexico Territory. Throughout the 1850s, Johnston had been in a battle over his appropriate rank. While he served in the post-Mexican War Army, Johnston was a lieutenant colonel, but Johnston believed he deserved the rank of colonel. During the Mexican War, he received 2 brevet promotions, The first one came at Cerro Gordo, which moved him from captain to lieutenant colonel, skipping over the rank of major. For his efforts in capturing Mexico City, he received another brevet promotion. Johnston believed the natural step would be to colonel, but the War Department and the Secretary of War, William L. Marcy, asserted he was only a lieutenant colonel because he entered the war as a captain, and 2 promotions would raise him to lieutenant colonel, not colonel. The Senate approved the Secretary of War's decision. In 1855, Johnston appealed his case again to someone he believed would sympathize, Secretary of War Jefferson Davis. Davis refused to reopen the case, stating that his predecessor had already ruled on it. Davis went further and stated that Johnston didn't serve as a lieutenant colonel during the campaign in Mexico, despite the official register of officers listing Johnston as a lieutenant colonel after Cerro Gordo. This would be the first disagreement between the 2 men. In 1857, President James Buchanan appointed John B. Floyd as the Secretary of War. Floyd had adopted Johnston's niece and nephew, Preston and Lizzie, after their parents had drowned. He was also the brother-in-law of one of Johnston's nephews. In a clear demonstration of nepotism, Floyd rejected the previous report and Senate decision and overturned them, making Johnston a colonel. Some of Johnston's comrades saw the promotion for what it was, nepotism. Robert E. Lee wrote to his brother that, "I think it must be evident to him that it never was the intention of Congress to advance him to the position assigned him by the Secretary." Johnston and Lydia traveled to McClellan's wedding in May 1860, and upon Johnston's return to Washington, he learned that General Thomas Jessup, the Quartermaster General of the Army for years, had passed away. That office was now vacant. Although Winfield Scott, as commander of the Army, was to choose Jessup's successor, Scott recommended 4 men to the Secretary of War for the Secretary to choose. On that list was Robert E. Lee, Albert Sidney Johnston, Charles F. Smith, and Joseph E. Johnston. Floyd chose Joe Johnston, and he became Quartermaster General of the Army with the rank of Brigadier General, the first graduate of West Point to obtain the rank of general in the regular army.